Good morning and welcome to today's Fridays with Vistage webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to go over some items to help you participate in today's webinar. If you are experiencing technical difficulties joining this WebEx session, please dial WebEx technical support at 1-866-779-3239. During the presentation, all participants' lines will be in listen mode only. To submit a written question at any time during the event, type your question into the Q&A panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. Just type your question into the text field and click Send. Please keep the Send to defaulted to all panelists. If the audio does not broadcast through your speakers, please join the teleconference. To join the teleconference, click the Request Teleconferencing button located in the Participants panel. It looks like a phone icon. A dialog box will pop up with the phone number to dial in with. I would now like to introduce you to the moderator for today's webinar, Mr. Dave Nelson.
Welcome, Vistage members and guests. I'm Dave Nelson, a 13-year Vistage member in the Pittsburgh area, part of Dick Singer's CE 676 group, and your Fridays with Vistage host. Today we're discussing improving your sales team's health and performance. Our expert guests are from the Predictive Index, Mike Zani and Greg Barnett. Hey, Mike and Greg, welcome to Fridays with Vistage. So Mike Zani is the CEO of the Predictive Index. He's based in the greater Boston area and provides overall strategic direction for the organization with an emphasis on global growth and product development to drive outstanding client results. He's an avid sailor. Mike began his career in marketing and sales with Vanguard sailboats and was coach for the 1996 U.S. Olympic sailing team. How cool is that? Mike holds a BS from Brown University and an MBA from Harvard. You're going to hear him speak first. Greg Barnett is the IO psychologist and VP of Research and Development at the Predictive Index, and he's responsible there for setting and executing, we call it PI, their scientific agenda, and leading the company's R&D department in the development, maintenance, and delivery of the Predictive Index's science-based behavioral and skills assessment. Before joining the Predictive Index, Greg was a senior managing consultant in IBM's Workforce Sciences and Analytics division. Greg holds a PhD and MA in Industrial Organizational Psychology from the University of Tulsa and a BA with honors in psychology from the University of Colorado. During today's webinar, if you have questions, please type them in the WebEx Q&A panel. We're going to answer as many as we can, but at the end, not as we go. So let's get started with Mike Zani. Mike, let's talk about improving your sales team's health and performance.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Really appreciate the introduction. My name is Mike Zani. I'm a 10-year Vistage member. Really excited to be with you here at Fridays with Vistage. And to be clear, we're talking about the sales team. We're not talking about product pricing or your value prop. Before we jump in, I would like to just share with you a little personal story about how Vistage changed my life. My business partner and I, his name is Daniel Muskies, we acquired a company called LEDCO, Law Enforcement Development Company, in 2004. You're actually looking at the inside of a police car. Now, we made a lot of the hardware that holds that computer in place, the docking station, the mounts, the console. And when we bought this company from its founder in 2004, we were 33, 34 respectively. We didn't know how to, this is our first time being leaders of an organization, and we joined Vistage really for what we believe are all the right reasons to make us better leaders. And I walked into my very first Vistage meeting, and which was then, it was in Detroit, called Tech 22 or Tech Detroit at the time. And they did a readback of my Predictive Index survey, and I had that aha moment where I thought they had called my mother and found out all of my behavioral quirks as they read this back publicly in my 15 new friends. After we sold LEDCO, Daniel and I ended up purchasing Shape Up and ExamSoft, and we brought PI with us to those companies. And lo and behold, 2014, we have the pleasure of, running the Predictive Index. We led the acquisition in 2014. So really, Vistage, the very first Vistage meeting that I was in, changed my life's trajectory. I love the role I'm in. I love this company. I hope this is the last and final company that I'm part of. And I owe that to Vistage. So I know sometimes our employees poke fun at us when we come back with crazy Vistage ideas, but they can really be life-changing. And I did want to share that anecdote with you. So as we jump in here, I am really a sales-centric CEO. I wanted to share with you just this anecdotal rule of thirds. This is not a scientific assessment, but it's the idea that when you're speaking with a lot of CEOs or leaders of sales organizations, that they feel a third of their players are really getting the job done and surpassing quota. A third of their players, something's missing, but they really have a hope that their B players can transition to A players over time. They're just not exactly sure how to push them in the right direction. And that a third of their players, or C players or worse, and they really wish they would go succeed somewhere else. And they're in various states of this. And you look at this sort of schematically, but let's dive into some of the facts. A TAS group sales study in 2013 showed that a third of your salespeople made quota in the last reporting period. So it does play out a bit. That roughly a third of sales professionals really do not develop competitive strategies for their opportunities. And, a third are struggling with designing customer-focused selling solutions. So it does play out a bit. So wanted to get in this with you today on how to diagnose your team using data, and data besides your quota data that you have. And we're gonna do this today by showing you methods to find out how to understand what drives your people, your salespeople specifically. Let's really think about what is their role and the nuances of that role. What are their core capabilities that they come to the job every day with? And what are the external complexities that they need to deal with in your organization? And what do those complexities then tell us that your people, their requirements that they need to live up to? So I wanted to kind of get us on the same page. Greg and I talk assessment all the time because we're sort of insiders. We just want to let you know what assessments we're going to be talking about today. We will talk about a behavioral assessment, which is a means to understand and measure the behavioral drives and needs of a person. We're going to be talking about a cognitive assessment, which measures sort of the cognitive horsepower or learning ability of a person. And we're going to be talking about a selling skills assessment, which is measuring the selling skills or really the situational decision-making in the sales process. So we'll be talking about these assessments as we move forward. So here's my schematic human being. We have labeled in the head, behavior and cognitive. These, what I'm talking about here is your behavioral preferences, led by what your behavioral drives and your needs, also your cognitive capabilities, and these are somewhat fixed. The research shows that somewhere between 8 and 18 years old, your behavior and cognitive trajectory is sort of set, meaning that your behavioral tendencies tend to get set and your cognitive sort of trajectory or capabilities are somewhat known. So when you exit high school, we kind of know these things and they are fixed. Now, what's in your briefcase, or if in fact we were dealing with millennials, what's in the backpack, these are the things that are learned over time, and this is often the focus of resumes: education, knowledge, skills, and experience. All of these things together are predicting workplace performance, or in this case, sales performance. When we need some diagnosis tools, what are the behavioral requirements and what are the behavioral fit with the given role, the given sales role? And what is the cognitive fit with the complexity of that role? We're talking about the complexity of your product, the complexity of the marketplace, maybe the amount of change that's going on within your organization, the amount of innovation going on within your organization, all change the complexity and thereby the potential demand for cognitive fit. And in the briefcase, with respect to sales, we're really talking about selling skills. Do your people come to the table knowing how to sell, or do you, in fact, have to coach them up a bit? So diving into the behavioral assessment, I'm gonna start here on behavioral, and I'm gonna hand off to Greg in a little bit when we talk about cognitive and the selling skills assessment. But starting with the behavioral assessment, we're going to talk about a behavioral assessment based on four factors that are commonly found in the workplace. There's a dominance factor, which we label A in red, an extraversion factor that we label as B, a patience factor we label as C, and a formality factor we label as D. I want to go through a few slides of just getting you up to speed on how to read this behavioral framework, just so that we can show you some takeaways about different sales behavioral patterns that we see in the marketplace. So it needs a little bit of backstory. The dominance drive. You can see that there's a little triangle in the bottom of the colored bar, and there's a bell curve, and I'm highlighting my mouse over it. When it's to the right of, when you have a high A drive, it's to the right of that triangle. When it's low, it is to the left. And you can see with someone with a high A or dominance drive, they have a need to make an impact. They need to put their thumbprint on things. They just can't let something go by without sort of modifying it in some way. When the A drive is low, when it's on the left-hand side, you have a tendency to include others in decision-making, to collaborate, and really come up with a best decision-making practice, the best idea, if you will. Jumping into the B drive, which is a measure of extraversion. This, many of you will be familiar with. High extroverts, or high B in this case, really want to talk through things with others. They're often very verbal, and they are good with spontaneous conversation. Conversely, on the low side, people who prefer time to think through before they talk, and are typically people of fewer words. The patience drive, when it's high, comfortable with familiarity, comfortable with process. When it's on the high side, on the low side, they respond positively with pressure and prefer variety, even need variety in their life. The last drive, the formality drive, or the D drive, when it's high, you see people with a tendency for framework and structure and rules. When it's low, individuals who don't want to be confined, less about rules, less about structure, they explore more and find the bounds of new ways of doing things. So there's a little backdrop into the four drives that I think will give you enough background to keep up with some of the patterns that we're going to show you. I think you need to learn how to read a behavioral pattern. This happens to be my behavioral pattern, so I'm exposing myself a little bit behaviorally. I have a 2 sigma high A dominance drive depicted in red. So I really like my way. I'll be even a little tolerant of conflict to put my ideas into practice. I'm highest B, just touching on 3 sigma, sort of a natural introvert. I really like to communicate and brainstorm and think through things with other people. My strongest drive is actually low C, that strong impatience, if you will, a need to juggle, a need for variety, and sort of it applies a pace to the way I do things. I naturally apply pressure to myself. And then my D drive, a little less formal, more casual, and a little less structured around rules. So that is my behavioral pattern. The reason I wanted to show you how to read a pattern is we're going to show you some patterns provided by sales organizations. So when we do this, I'd like to show you a couple of relationships that are really important. The first one is the A-B relationship. So on the left here, I'm showing you that when A is high and D is low, or when A is greater than D, you have a very risk-tolerant behavioral pattern. People who tend to like new ways of doing things. They lean to be generalists. They like making their own rules. they gravitate towards strategy and bigger vision, and they are very results driven. And conversely, on the right-hand side, we're showing you a D greater than A relationship, which is a natural risk avoider. This is someone who prefers the proven way. They gravitate towards being a specialist. They're more about following rules, and they're really exceptional with tactics and execution and details and attention to detail specifically. And these two individuals, depicted by these behavioral patterns, can play roles in your organization that are incredibly important. But keep in mind the AD risk relationship. One more relationship that I'd like to share with you: the AB relationship. When A is greater than B, you have a things or task tendency. What this is, someone who is more focused on planning, analysis, problem solving, and synthesizing ideas. Very direct in the way they address individuals and people. When the B is greater than the A, meaning the B is to the right of the A, you have people who really spend a lot more time communicating, motivating, team building, and trusting and building trust in their organization. People with very different approaches to things and or people and what they think about first. So the reason I built up all the factors in these two factor combinations is we wanted to show you a little bit of a framework of how you might be able to think about your sales organization. So this is going to be a sports analogy, so I apologize to individuals in the audience who aren't crazy sports fanatics, but it's a pretty simple one. This is soccer or football if you're from the rest of the world. And we're talking about on the offensive side, these in business, these are your hunters, your new business developers. They're measured on pipeline building, and they are measured on closing. These are people who are natural closers. And we're showing you a pattern of someone who is highly dominant. They have a high dominance drive and very low C, where very impatient, where their C is very low. This pattern is someone who, if they lose 7 deals in a row, they are not concerned. The 8th deal is going to be their lucky charm. They're not deterred by rejection. They are very results. They're very driven. They're risk tolerant, and they're self-driven, driving themselves on an everyday basis. These are your warriors who are out trying to, the offense of your organization is your revenue. Now, I want to jump to your defenders in the business setting. You see people much more risk tolerant, intolerant, or risk avoiders, more rules, more process, more patience, not as much verbal. And you see, they're playing supporting roles or specialist roles. These can be your, technical salespeople or your implementation team. Very strong attention to detail. They are all about executing perfection and about being specialists in their field. Now, I would like to show you why we put the midfield in here. This pattern typified, these are your farmers, relationship builders. They are in the AB relationship. We showed you very people-centric. They can upsell. They're not like your hunters who are driven by the transaction and closing, but they will upsell to people they know when they have a need. They are great relationship builders and exceptional with customer service. The reason we did the sports analogy with soccer was that the midfielders have a little bit of skills on both sides. They can go up towards your to help with your offensive team and support them, and they can go down to your defense team on execution and support them. They are really your bridgers here, and they can balance your organization so that they can really be the bridgers between the people who are your specialists and your hunters in the field. Because in this particular schematic that we're showing you, your offense and defense do not think alike. They don't communicate well with each other, and they would really benefit from having some midfielders in the mix or bridging between them. So this is a simple schematic that we put into place. Now, obviously, we would have to understand your business better to understand. We're not espousing that you need a 3-person sales team with hunters, farmers, and specialists. But we really think you have different roles within your sales organization, and they are typified by different behavioral profiles. I wanted to go in and show you an example, a real case study that we used at Ledco. So when Daniel, my business partner, and I acquired Ledco, we acquired it from a 65-year-old founder. This founder was someone who built this company from scratch and built basically a 40-person organization that completely supported him. This was his kingdom, his fiefdom. He was the head salesperson, he was the head engineer, he was the head product person, and really built an organization to support him. I mean, he actually needed Vistage pretty badly. It turns out he's 65, he was getting tired, he sold the company to Daniel and I, and when we inherited the company, we inherited a sales team, and the sales team had this pattern, which was an unusual pattern for a sales team. This is that of the specialist. This is a group analytics composite showing the 10 people on the sales team that we inherited. And, I will do the interpretation for you. This is not a people-oriented team, a very reactive, risk intolerant, slower to connect with people, and formal in their approach. Now, this was the team that the owner built around himself, and they were really good at executing his wishes. And his wishes at the time when we invested in Ledco, keep in mind, we're selling to police departments, and in police departments, they would walk in the back door through the garage, which is called fleet. They would find the person responsible for the vehicles. They would typically bring them a box of donuts, and they were trying to slowly over time build relationships with the people who maintained the cars. And that's how they went about selling, components that went into vehicles. We realized quite quickly that there was a shift in the police departments, that this is 2004, computers were going into vehicles in great numbers, and we realized that fleet was not going to be the decision maker here, but really it was the IT departments. And we realized we needed a different approach. We needed to sell in the front door, not the back door. We needed to put down the box of donuts. We needed to put on a blazer and a tie and pick up our computers and start selling with things like PowerPoint and video and data and a return on investment. So we ended up over a 4-year period recrafting our team and building a much more risk-tolerant, communication, impatient and less formal team, someone who could go in and talk strategically with the senior IT department in police organizations. And just wanted to show you the results over 4 years, we drastically changed the team. Now, not all of the individuals on your left left our organization. We found different roles for them. But in a 4-year period of time, we were really able to take the company, Ledco, from 4th in market share to 1st. We had a 4-time revenue increase and a 3.5-time EBITDA performance increase. It was really a great turnaround, and we credit the use of behavioral analytics with really helping us recraft, retool this team. And as I said to you, we were clients of PI. We were new to this tool, and we sort of embraced it, whole hog, because it finally gave us a key to insights into some of our, some of the people in our organization. And Greg, I'd like to hand it off to Dr. Greg Barnett, who's going to walk us through the cognitive assessment and selling skills assessment portion of the analysis.
Great. Thank you, Mike. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. I did want to say that Mike just showed a story or an example of a case that he experienced. We, in fact, have hundreds of research studies that show much of the same thing. So it's not just one story. It's something that we have a lot of knowledge on, a lot of evidence on, and it's a tried and true element of good sales is understanding behavioral styles like this. So something to keep in mind that for every story you hear, there's often great data behind it, and we've got some of that. Now, moving over to the next part of this, Mike had talked about the head, and the first part was the behavior. Now we're moving into cognitive assessment. Cognitive assessment When we change into the people analytics puzzle on this, we're generally talking about measures of general cognitive ability. Oftentimes, these terms are simply called G. At its core, G is the basis of about 100 years of research that shows that people with higher general cognitive ability scores tend to do better on all sorts of cognitive tests. So they're better at reading, they're better at memorization, they're better at math. And from a really clear business implication perspective, they have a really strong ability to learn. In fact, the evidence is completely overwhelming. In fact, being in the world of academics, there are a few topics that don't get debated anymore because academics love to debate every little piece of every theory. But the link between cognitive ability and performance is so strong that people aren't even talking about it anymore. It's sort of an accepted truth. And at that truth is the idea that people who learn faster do better at work because they onboard faster, they go through training faster, they're quicker about on-the-job learning, they're able to solve problems quicker, they learn their way through complexity, they think through things for decision-making, and they adapt to changes more quickly. And really at the heart of it is the idea that they learn, process, and apply what's learned very quickly. In fact, in today's modern economy, the need for cognitive ability has never been higher. And there are forces at work that you see at the bottom of the slide that really are asking and begging for more cognitive ability in all types of roles. There's the idea of increased complexity. We all know that technology is changing every day. Organizations are changing every day. Hyperconnectedness, the way in which teams work together, companies collaborate, social connections between people. And then there's the accelerated rate of change. I mean, every day there's another disruption, there's another innovation, there's new entrants, and there's organizations that are dealing with new technologies and having to adapt. So the ability to learn and learn quickly has a very serious impact on job performance. Now, in the sales world, complexity is at the heart of really understanding the idea of how much cognitive demand is there. So what do I really need out of my salespeople? And so when you're thinking about defining the role and thinking about the role and what's needed, these are some things to consider. One of them is, what are my customers like? How complex are my customers? Are they small and agile and able to react quickly, or are they slow and complex and there's a lot of steps that I need to take? Is your product easy to understand, or is it really technologically advanced? The process that sales takes place through, is it step by step? Or are there a lot of and ifs and decisions that need to be made in order to close deals and get contracting done? And finally, obviously a very big one is the idea of the industry. Is it mature and stable and kind of the same thing that was selling 5 years ago is about the same today? Or are we really talking about the idea of there's disruption, there's changes, there's innovation, and it's hard to keep up? So let me take you through an example of how this really plays out with the idea of cognitive ability. Now, I have a really good friend, and he is among the top salespeople in selling boxes. So he's a good friend, so he's pretty honest about his job. And he talks about it being something that we would consider kind of a flat, stable amount of complexity. So this line, this purple line you see, is an example of, okay, in an environment where I'm selling the same thing, it's a box, it's not really complicated, it's the same customers usually year in, year out, it's a pretty average amount of complexity. It stays rather stable. And so when we look at people who have either higher cognitive ability or lower cognitive ability, we're really wondering how fast are they able to get there, and can they keep up with the complexity? So when it's flat, we might look at someone who's your learn quickly person, someone who has a higher cognitive ability score, and we would say, well, they look like they get there pretty fast, but someone with a lower score can equally get there about the same time because the complexity isn't so high that it's demanding too much cognitive ability. Now, the reality is not everybody is in the world of selling boxes. So if we change directions and we look at an example of more typical complexity in the sales environment, so think about technology sales or pharmaceutical sales, things like that, we tend to see the products, the customers, the market, everything is changing often. It takes a lot to stay up to date, both with what's going on and in the industry, with your own product, and what your customers are expecting. Now, in this case, this is where you start to really see the difference. In this case, we'll look at the first person who is a high cognitive ability person who learns very quickly. They're able to get there and get themselves up to speed in a good amount of time. When we compare it to somebody who's lower, you'll see they get there, but they get there a lot more slowly. And as we say in business, time is money. And so when you see something like this, what we're really saying is it's critical to understand that the complexity of your roles, of your environment, is a great thing that you need to think about and understand, and be able to think about your sales force and their ability to meet that complexity in order to be able to learn quickly, act quickly, and perform at a high level. So we're going to switch directions from cognitive, which is obviously a very important part that comes from the head, and talk about the briefcase. And the briefcase is largely about the idea of experience. So most great salespeople, they have the right behavioral style. They can learn quickly enough to meet the demands of the environment. But just because you're a fast learner and you're really aggressive doesn't mean you're going to be successful. So this is where sales skills comes in. It's largely about the experiences that people have when you can answer the question, does this person know how to do the things necessary to successfully navigate the sales process? So for us, we have a tool called the Selling Skills Assessment. And the Selling Skills Assessment tool is a way in which we assess how well a person has the core skills that are often required for more of a customer-focused and consultative sales process. The assessment itself is what we call a situational judgment type of assessment. So it provides a number of scenarios to a person who's taking it, and then they're scored based on the quality of their responses or their decisions to the different pieces of the sales when they're going through the sales process. So in particular with the SSAT assessment, we start off and we ask questions around understanding how do they open? Do they open the process right? Do they get the client's attention? Do they manage expectations? Do they get in the door? How well they can investigate. So now they're in the door, but they need to ask the right questions, and they need to also show that they can listen effectively. Once they've got the interest at that level, it's time to go into the presentation phase. And this is where you're going to be articulating the value to a client, trying to link your product, your solution, directly to the client's needs. We also get at whether, once it's coming down to time to close it, it's about the big steps of asking for the business, being able to handle the objections, thinking about how I'm going to close this deal and get this thing moving forward. And finally, the last part we look at is once the deal is closing, am I managing expectations right? Am I going to be focusing on customer relationship management? And am I looking for cross-selling opportunities? And you can see with this assessment the kind of the results, the way they play out. We have an example of a John Smith. When you see something like this, we see that he's strong in some areas, but for example, he tends to be a little weaker in the present area. So that would be an area you would focus on, for example, in training. Because skills are something that can be trained versus behavioral tendencies and cognitive ability, this is where we get into the idea of what we're learning here isn't just about performance, but it's also about what we can do with using effective training. The other really neat thing about doing an SSAT type approach is you can look at your entire sales force. So in this example, you also see that the entire sales force tends to have a gap or a weakness when it comes directly to the idea of presenting. So you could target a lot of training and try to build the capabilities of your sales force by doing this kind of assessment work. So we've covered a lot of different things. Mike went into depth about behavioral requirements. I talked about the idea of cognitive and complexity, and we just covered the idea of skills assessments, which are pretty simple but get at something very critical to really good sales performance. Well, just to kind of to conclude that part of it, the diagnosis checklist is on the screen. And the idea is as you think about what we're talking about, which is using analytics to diagnose your own sales force, these are really the guidelines on which you should be thinking about and the questions you should be asking. You should focus on the role, and you should focus on your staff. So for the role, the kinds of questions you're wondering is what kind of roles do we need to be successful? Do we need all hunters? Do we need some farmers? We also want you to ask, how complex is my sales environment? And what does that mean about the staff that I need? What kind of people do I need in here that are able to really come in and understand and learn quick enough to be successful for my company? And finally, we ask you to think about what kinds of skills are needed. What are the types of skills for your unique sales environment that are most important? And then how is your sales force measuring up, and can you do training to improve it? Once you've done this diagnosis, we start to head into what us IO psychologists start to consider the fun part of this. And that's really around taking the data and doing something with it. Now, on the screen, I want to point out that you're seeing what is kind of an outlay of some of our look into the roles and then looking at the individual. At the bottom, what we're using is, these are sort of the targets you're shooting for. So we're saying, you know, we need hunter roles, we've determined there's a moderate amount of complexity, and we'd like to see the sales skills around a certain percentage. And now we start looking at the individual. So this is Tim W. We're looking at him against a hunter role, and here's what we know. He's got a good behavioral fit, so he's got the right behavioral drives and tendencies to be successful. He's got the right cognitive score to be able to handle the complexity of the role. He's got a good selling skills score. So overall, he's a strong fit, and on top of that, he's knocking his quota out of the park. Now, that's one line of data. So the next step in the process is when you start to really go to the next level and think about your entire sales force collectively. And you'll see on this slide, there's a lot of examples where sometimes people are great in some areas, but not others. You've got some, you kind of start to see the rule of thirds line up, and that's what you'll probably see with your data. There are people that are great at the sales skills and not so great at the behavioral fit. There are people that maybe have some challenges with the complexity. The goal when you're doing this is really twofold. I mean, one side is if you've got enough people to do this, you can go the way of a very statistical approach, and you can identify with very straight-up analytics what you would consider the story behind your data. You can determine exactly what you need, what those numbers mean, and connect everything with statistical significance. But if your company's smaller, this activity is equally important because what you're doing is you're putting an objective viewpoint into who your people are, and it gives you data and information to help you make decisions and understand what's going on. And once you've done this, the first step of it is diagnosing. So now you've got this great data. What do you do with it? Well, the easiest place to take that information and translate it into work is in the hiring side of things. We know what it looks like to be, what a successful performer looks like. So what we want to do is hire more of those people. And we've got data and tools that allow us to do that. So once you've got these data and tools, you can start to change your hiring process and give you a chance at finding people who have a much higher likelihood of being successful. And along the way, you can also realize that sometimes there are people that have that core DNA, so they've got the right behavioral style, they can handle the complexity, but they might still need to be trained better and to become more knowledgeable on how to sell. So in the hiring process, you can start to decide both who's got a good chance of being successful right out of the gate, and who's worth it to invest in for training because they have the raw stuff that's likely to make them successful. When we kind of look at what that looks like in a hiring process, it's not just about finding the best talent. That's always obviously one piece of this, but it's really about streamlining your own time when you're doing this. So the benefits of moving this great data that you did during the diagnosis into something like this is both you're able to increase your chances of making better hires, but you're also likely to spend less time wasted with other people that aren't going to have as good a chance of being successful. So in this case, we want the people that are in that upper right-hand quadrant. We want them to be high behavioral fits. They're going to have the style that's needed to sell, and we want them to have that right amount of cognitive fit, a high amount of it, so we know that they can handle the complexity. And then when you're using the skills testing, you can also right away know when I'm looking at these people, who am I hiring that's going to come in and be ready, and who's going to need that a little extra work for training, and you can even budget for it and expect that in their timeline of being an employee. So great place to put the data to work, instant ROI for you, and pretty easy to do. Once we kind of go back to your original question, which is my current sales force or your current sales force, you're not just looking at bringing new people in. You have this data, and we call it, it's time to think about the triage. So what can I do based on what I know to increase the effectiveness of my sales force right now? There's repositioning them, so that's putting people in the right positions. There's training and development, and then there's the manager-manage-out piece of this. Repositioning, going back to the soccer field, is really about the idea of understanding that there are different roles in the sales process and that you may have people that are very talented but for the wrong fit. As you can tell, just looking at this person on the right side in blue versus what's in green, which is sort of the ideal pattern for success, you can see that basically this line goes a completely opposite direction, and that's that's indicative of pretty bad fit. This is somebody who pretty much wants to do the process and procedures and be a team player, interest in going out and being aggressive. What do? You take that person and you move them down and you reposition them. You've got positions that are available. Very simply, you have the data that shows where they're going to fit, and it gives you an opportunity to do this effectively and not have to just manage them out of the company. Instead, you put them in a place where not only they be more happy, but you'll be more happy with them. Then there's training and development, which is pretty self-explanatory, and I won't go over too many details on this slide, other than to say I think the biggest mistake that goes on with training and development in sales is that it's a one-off situation. And so you'll see here our approach to training, which involves starting with understanding a benchmark of your people, a learning process, applying, a reassessment, a coaching, another assessment, and an analysis of what's changed. If you're going to go about training people, the key is you know who they're going to be, you know what skills they're going to need to be trained, and it's important to make this something that's not just a short-term event, but really an ongoing learning event.
Great, Greg. Greg wanted me to jump in and take the managed component. I've had quite the opportunity to manage sales teams at a number of organizations, and one of the joys when you actually have this data is of behavioral data specifically is being able to help manage people. And as either as sales leaders or as leaders of our organizations, one of our most important roles is to bring out what's really special within our people. And I wanted to dive into coaching because when you're looking at managing or managing out, you'd much prefer to manage someone into a position of success than to have them manage them out of your organization. I wanted to dive into this to get back to the behavioral drives. Once you know someone's behavioral drives, an easy way to have quick wins in coaching is to coach to someone's highest drive. So when you need to coach someone who is highest A, like your typical hunters, if you want them to change their behavior, you need to redefine what winning is. And I would say this is the single greatest challenge for most of our Vistage chairs. There are a lot of highest A individuals as entrepreneurs in Vistage groups, and they built their companies like the founder of Ledco did, where it was built in their sort of own image, and winning was them doing everything. The redefine of the win was getting them to win through their people. It's a big change, but if you find someone who is highest A on your team, redefining the win is the easiest way to get them to change their behavior. With highest B individuals, it's all about perception. These people really like to influence people to a positive response. If they feel they're being misperceived, you have their attention, and they will actively try to change their behavior because they really don't want to be misperceived. They want to make sure that people are understanding, they like to sell ideas, and they want to make sure that those ideas are coming across clearly. So it's about perception. With highest C individuals, it's really about a process. These people like process, familiarity. If you want to change highest C individuals, it's really about getting with them, understanding the process they're doing, and building a new process in light of what you would like to change. And with highest D, these are your people who are structured, rules. You often see this in your technology teams, your tech specialists, your engineers. It's really about redefining rules. And oftentimes, it's not just the written rules, but it's really the social mores of your organization. Like it's okay to make a mistake occasionally. You're not going to lose your job from one mistake, and almost being permissive to relax that behavior and change that behavior. So the ability to coach. Unfortunately, there are times when you really don't have the right behavioral fit, you don't have the right cognitive fit, you don't have the right sales skills, inability to coach, and you really have to not only do you not hire, but you have to actively manage these people out of your organization. When we get back to the rule of thirds, your organization is too valuable and the opportunity cost too large for you to keep a third of your sales team, underproductive. And, you look at Jack Welch, who used to put in sort of a machine of 10 to 20% of the lowest performers in the organizations were called. And, quite clearly the reason they did that was because the top people are getting attracted away and cherry-picked away. So over time, you'll be left with the bottom half to the bottom third. So you have to actively manage out. And this gives you a framework to at least have some data in order to understand maybe first how to coach, and then if coaching is impossible, how to manage out. So this sort of wraps up the session today. I would like to open it up to Q&A. I'm sure there's some deep questions, both specifically about assessments and about how this all ties together. And you can address it to myself or Greg or both.
Yeah, so please feel free to type your question in the Q&A panel, and I'm just going to jump right in. And I guess the first question I'd like to start with is sort of the logistics question. Glenn Williams is asking, are these multiple choice tests, and how long does it take to administer these assessments? So Mike Zani, could you take a run at that one?
Great. Thanks for the question, Glenn. These assessments, they're all different. So the behavioral assessment is what's called a free choice assessment. It is you're not forced choice like multiple choice. So it's a very painless test in which to take, and it averages 6.5 minutes, which is very low load in the testing world. So the behavioral assessment is a 6.5 minute free choice. The cognitive assessment is a timed assessment. Due to the nature of cognitive assessments, they often need to be timed. It's a 12-minute assessment, and it dives into mathematical, verbal, and spatial. The self skills assessment is untimed, typically takes 10 to 15 minutes, and it is a multiple choice format. So when you look at the entire thing, it's around 30 minutes of assessment. You can choose to do it all at the same time. We often tell people to stagger them depending on the role and your own hiring practice, but you can certainly do it early in the process. It's light enough that you can do it very early in the hiring process, so you're not investing a lot of time before a candidate might screen out, so that you don't invest a lot of your manager's valuable time interviewing people who really shouldn't be considered.
Cool. Throw this one at Greg, and I imagine that sometimes if I've got an existing sales team, they might be resistant to this. What are your thoughts about how to lower that resistance or get them more comfortable with being tested, as it were, or measured at least?
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of times this question comes up, and one of the first things is that it really differs by the culture of the organization. So some cultures are, very high trust, and doing things like this are almost seen as fun and informational, and they can be used to coach, and people aren't afraid of the results, and people are who they are. And there are other cultures that are much more low trust, where things like this are perceived as being threats to the job and, a concern for why am I taking this? So really it's those low trust culture companies where the concern comes in. And I think usually it does involve a couple of things. One of them is just a really, you have to approach it like you're selling to salespeople. You need to have a good message behind it, why you're doing it, how the data is going to be used. You need to show, you need to be able to be true to what you said. So if the rule is data won't be shared with anyone except for one person, then you need to stay, true to those words and build trust around the process.
Excellent. I want to go back to Mike with this next question. And, we talked about 3 different assessments, the behavioral, the cognitive, and the skills assessment. What's the relative importance or sort of order of priority on that? Where can I possibly, I'll call it remediate or train, versus where should I, if I get a certain result, it's like that's a deal killer.
Right. That's a great question. And, we sort of, in the webinar, we're showing in sort of thirds. And it in fact is not a perfect balance. And what I'd like to do is show you some extreme examples. if you look at Cisco Systems in the 90s, these are the people who were selling the switches and building the internet at an incredible pace with technology that most people had never even heard of, and they were selling to other technologists that were, on the bleeding edge of what was going on. So in that particular example, you would overweight cognitive heavily, and you're looking for people who learn quickly, who can really keep up with the technology and can sort of be a good peer to the buyers who are other technologists on the bleeding edge who are looking for partners in this thing of building out the internet. Now, you would tolerate, in that particular example, you would probably downplay sales skills. If you're selling into bleeding edge IT technologists, they're probably very tolerant of sloppy sales skills. They want to make sure that they're getting the best, the brightest, and the best equipment. Whereas, you go to Greg's example of, a box salesperson, and not to throw his friend under the bus, you don't need quite as much high of a cognitive, because you're looking at a recurring consumable, very little change. But sales skills in that particular instance are important, making sure that you keep up, make sure that you constantly investigate, that you're, enough touch points, and that you are running through this sales process continually so that you can upsell. So the situation depends on how you're going to balance these assessments across your organization, because they should not be weighted equally. And the second part to your question is, are there disqualifiers? Now, we don't believe that any one variable should kick someone out of a process. You really have to look at it holistically. You're looking at their resume, you're listening to their phone screen, you're looking at their entire package. But you definitely want to focus on the people that are your highest potential. Greg did a 2x2 matrix superimposed with sales skill, and he says let's focus on the upper right box. I think you should approach it that way and not let any one dimension be a disqualifier.
So, sort of related or building on that question, Sue has asked, how do you use this part of your hiring process, and have these assessments been legally challenged or proven from a validity and reliability perspective? In other words, could I have, specific thresholds I'm looking for on certain dimensions and use that as a go, no-go decision and be in a legally defendable position, I suppose?
I'll take the front half of that about where we use it in the hiring process, and I'll let Greg address some of the compliance issues. I think he's better positioned to do that. With respect to the hiring process, it's, we can give you best practices, but it's really important to understand your hiring process to plug them in at the appropriate location. We can tell you what our best practices are. That when we're hiring for a position, the first assessment that we send out is the behavioral assessment. And this is a very, very painless assessment. It's at 6.5-minute free choice. And we send it right after the first 30-minute phone screen. So someone sends in a resume, their resume triggers enough interest that they get a 30-minute phone screen. We send that behavioral assessment to them, make sure there's a fit, interact with their response. If there's a high probability fit, they get taken to the next stage. The reason we do this is we found that if you interject the sales skills assessment or the cognitive assessment too early in the process, before the candidate has gotten interest in the position, you can actually have some unnecessary fallout. And we help you build that process, our consultants do, but there is some investigation to understand what does your organization currently do. What are the challenges you might have? You might be a bulk hirer, or you might be sort of an infrequent hire. And we just want to make sure that that process fits into your organization. But there isn't a espoused best practices that we can share with you. The second part, I'll let Greg Barnett address.
Sure. I think as Mike was saying, part of it is how do you use the tools, which is really about the extent to which legal challenges come into play. We always just sort of try to, I think, use it as a data point is a little bit safer. As companies think about making more stringent decisions based on assessments, the importance of them being valid and reliable goes up. Luckily, all of these assessments predict what they predict. We've got 300 plus studies just on the behavioral assessment alone that show that we predict job performance. It meets standards of reliability. The cognitive test is the same in terms of its build and in terms of measuring cognitive ability, which is important on a lot of jobs, and skills assessments measure skills. So really, when you're using them, I think the question is, yes, they are all legally okay to use for and valid for what we say they do. The question often just comes down to using them correctly and being smart stewards of using something like this, using this kind of data in the hiring process. At the end of the day, the biggest risk for any company is actually the unstructured interview. And if you're using assessments, you generally are being more objective about your decision making. You're adding, you're using data points that tend to inform the decisions rather than some of the unconscious biases or the conscious biases that lead companies down more serious legal risk.
Fabulous. So let's go to these last couple of questions, sort of related. Dan asked part, Geraldine asked part. So let's start with the Dan side of it because it's the logical opener, and that is, how does one set proper benchmarks for your company? And do all existing salespeople need to take the assessments? What if you have different locations, maybe different size locations, different customer types? How do you go about sort of setting your initial targets?
I'll take that, Dave. With respect to benchmarks, it really depends a lot on the size and complexity of your company, as the person who asked the question pointed out. We certainly provide tools which will help you set benchmarks, and these are other assessments, believe it or not, that you go through to say what are the behavioral and cognitive requirements of that particular role. So if you have very few people, you rely, or you're just getting started, you rely on that, which is it's a benchmark setting tool within the software. When you have more people than that, we do group analytics. So you look at your top quartile, top decile, top half, and let some of your data, your high performer data and your low performer data, let's look at that data and see what your data shows us. Who's being successful within your organization, and are there some drivers as to why? Now, with larger companies where the employee size is, say, north of 25, you can often do validity studies. And we've, as Greg pointed out earlier, we've done over 450 validity studies. And I think 125 of these are specifically sales related, where huge enterprise software companies where we're assessing 250 of their sales team to find out what are the scientifically validated drivers that show who's being successful and who not. So the question of benchmarking depends on the size of your company, and we sort of provide sort of a small, medium, and large tool set so that you can set benchmarks accordingly. And that's a very important question. You have to know what you're measuring against. But we also give you a tremendous amount of data. Our consultants, when they sit with you, we've sort of seen this movie before, and when you explain your sales process, we can help consult you to get you in, to very close with respect to your benchmarks right off the bat.
Okay, and then sort of the last question building on that, does it ever happen, and if so, what do you do when you have somebody, maybe even an existing person who scores, low on a benchmark, but turns out to be a great performer? What is that saying? What do you do?
I can take that. I mean, one thing to know is that while assessments add a lot of data and value to your decision making, that they aren't always perfect, and that there are also other things that can influence success. For example, one that is not assessed in the sense of hiring is employee engagement. So motivation and employee engagement and how happy and charged someone is can, no matter how good of a fit they are, can lead them to be less of a performer. And when you look at the tools we've talked about, really, when you do the statistics, and it's pretty well documented, they give you a sense of around 50%. If used correctly, they predict about 50% of someone's performance on the job, or explain it, which means that there's still other things that are unexplainable, and that's part of the challenge of people and talent. People are really complex. Tools like this give you a real leg up. They help you to understand 50% of what they're going to do, but things like I said, their manager can be no good, their engagement might not be great, they might have things outside their life, maybe they just aren't great at selling this product. There are other factors that always come into play that accounts for the other percent of getting them to be the best.
All right, well, that's probably a good perspective to end on, although I got to say this hour went way too fast. So thanks, Mike Zani and Greg Barnett, for a really wonderful overview of PI and the other assessment tools and how it can be used to help us improve our sales team's performance.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right, folks, join us again for our next webinar. It's going to be just a couple weeks from now, Friday, September 9, and we'll be discussing how to get the right financial reports for your business. As always, you can register at vistage.com/FWV, as in Fridays with Vistage. And that's a public site, so you can invite coworkers or outside colleagues to join us for these Fridays with Vistage. And if you want to share today's recording, including the slides, with anyone in your organization logging into My Vistage, you can access past recordings at vistage.com/webinars and the slides as well. So on behalf of Mike Zani and Greg Barnett and the entire team at Vistage International, I'm Dave Nelson. Thank you for joining us today. Have a great weekend.